For the last part of this class today, we're going to look at language acquisition perspectives and look at three different theories or perspectives of language acquisition. The first one is by behaviorist B.F. Skinner. You've probably heard of him in your education experience. And his perspective says that the environment is the source of learning a language. He says that when children imitate the language produced by those around them, and their attempts are received with a positive reinforcement, they're encouraged to continue to imitate and practice those sounds. Behaviorists view imitation and practice as the primary process of language development. And so you can see that it has more to do with the environment. Encouraged by the environment, children continue to do what they are doing, and then they develop or form those habits. The quality and quantity of the language the child hears, as well as the consistency of the reinforcement offered by others in the environment, shapes the child's language behavior. Behaviorists view imitation and practice as the primary process of that development. And here's an example. A teacher might, or a mother might say, shall we play with the dolls? And the little girl would say, play with dolls. Yes, play with dolls, and then that might be something that becomes part of their language. A little boy named Peter might say, get more, and the mom might reply, oh yes, you're going to put more wheels on the dump truck? And then Peter would say, dump truck, wheels, yes, dump truck, and be able to produce more and more language based on what mom does and how mom reacts to him. Children appear to imitate selectively, however. The choice of what to imitate seems to be based on something new that they have just begun to understand and use, not simply on what is just available in the environment. And also, we see that the choice of what to imitate and practice seems determined by something inside the child than the environment itself. All right, moving on to the next perspective, we'll talk a little bit about the innatist perspective, and this, really the scientist behind this is Noam Chomsky, and you'll hear Chomsky again a few times as we go throughout this course. Chomsky's hypothesis is that all human languages are based on some innate universal principle. Children are biologically programmed for language, and that language develops in the child just the same way the other biological functions develop. For example, as the child learns to walk, they develop certain functions that help them walk. Children come to know more of the language that they could reasonably be expected. Thus, they are born with specific innate abilities to discover the underlying rules of the language system they're exposed to. This is often linked to two other terms that we'll talk about in more detail later: the universal grammar, or the UG perspective, and the critical period hypothesis. These are really tough to study because we don't want to keep a child from learning or hide a child from language. And so they're really difficult to study. Researchers who study the innate perspective argue that such complex grammar could never be learned purely on the basis of imitating sentences and those kinds of things, and that there has to be some innate ability in order to be able to do that. And so one of the things that they've used as part of this study is, I don't know if you've seen The Wild Boy, but this was a boy, his name was Victor, and he was found wandering naked in the woods in France. It's been in a couple of films, but he was found by Jean-Marc, who was a young doctor and was accustomed to working with deaf children. And so he devoted 5 years to socializing Victor and teaching him the language. And although he succeeded in some extent in developmentally, socially, his memory, his judgment, there was little progress in his language ability, and he forever remained behind the peers of his age. And then there's one other story. I think this was a 13-year-old girl who had been isolated and neglected and abused in California. Her parents had tied her to a chair in her crib. She was in a dark room. Her siblings and her mother were not allowed to talk to her at all, and her father only grunted to her. And when she was eventually found and cared for and educated by Susan Curtis, she went through a rehabilitation and developed a lot of deep personal relationships and strong bonds with people around her. But after 5 years of exposure to language, her language was not like that of a typical 5-year-old, and her grammatical forms were inconsistent and overused, as someone might, not have the ability in routine speech. And so there is, a couple of examples there, but nothing concrete to be able to prove that perspective. We do know that language acquisition begins at birth or even before in the mother's womb, and as the child's brain develops and is exposed to the language and the environment, that they continue to learn and grow. And so that leads us into our next perspective, and that's the Interactionist developmental perspective. And you'll probably be familiar with these two scientists as well, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. In this perspective, they believe that there's interplay between the innate learning ability of a child and the environment. So this is kind of a balance between the two. And they argue that language acquisition is one example of the human child's ability to learn from experience. Piaget talks about language, that it is built on cognitive development and interaction with the things that can be observed and manipulated around them. And Vygotsky talks about, in a supportive interactive environment, children are able to advance to higher levels of knowledge and performance. And you're probably familiar with his zone of proximal development, or his theories of being able to support through scaffolding. And it's very much the same way with the interaction with language. If they have a supportive environment where they're pushed and scaffolded, they're able to learn faster and better than others. And so you can see that there's a balance between, yes, we have some innate ability to learn the language, but we also have to interact with our environment. So back to those three perspectives, you'll want to remember those, and we'll discuss those further. The behaviorist perspective with B.F. Skinner, Norm Chomsky's innatist perspective, really focused back here on environment, and here focused on the innate ability to learn a language, and then the balanced approach with Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky about how we need both. We do need the innate ability and also the environment to be able to learn a language. And then finally, just to finish up today, there's a lot of studies that have happened just recently on child bilingualism in schools and different things, and there really is no evidence that learning two languages substantially slows down linguistic development or even interferes with cognitive development. And in fact, achieving bilingual proficiency can have positive effects on abilities that are related to academic success. They found that continual development of a child's home language actually contributes to long-term success or acquisition in school languages. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's that cognitive academic language proficiency, or CALP language. And I think one of the myths or things that we've been taught in the past is that they're not learning English at school because they go home and they only speak Spanish. But that's really not the case. In fact, that's called subtractive bilingualism, and it has a negative effect on a child's self-esteem, relationships with their families, and even an eventual loss of the family language altogether. And it's super important that we encourage parents to continue their home language and to support the child's development in both languages, and those will make links to what they're learning in school and support the learning in both languages. If parents continue to use the language that they know best with their children, they are able to express their language and ideas in ways that are richer and more elaborate than they could ever manage in a language that they don't know very well. And so it supports both languages. And then finally, we should practice additive bilingualism by maintaining home languages where the second language is learned in school and the language at home is supported and encouraged, so that they can be truly bilingual, which has positive effects on students in a lot of ways. So just finishing up today, you'll want to now log on and do the discussion questions that talk about the languages, perspectives that we've learned today, and answer some of the questions and communicate with your peers about the things that we've learned today. And again, if you have any further questions, about the assignments or anything, please just shoot me an email through my school email. I don't always check my Canvas email. And I will see you next week.